So you are joining a class today that's called an Introduction to Herb Gardening, and I'm so excited that so many people are interested in such a class. We are living in a time where we are all at home trying to take care of ourselves and take care of our families, and I can't think of a better way to do that than with adding some herbs to our garden. So we are going to talk a little bit all about herbs. The session is set up as general introduction to herb gardening for those of you that have not done herb gardening in the past. This is the perfect class for you. If you're a little bit more advanced, you might still have some questions or you might be a little bit bored, but hopefully everyone can learn a few things from this presentation today. I just wanted to start with a quick introduction to the University of Maryland. So University of Maryland Extension is part of the cooperative extension system with the land grant University of Maryland. Every institution across the United States has land grant systems, and within that land grant system is a cooperative extension service. So no matter where you're joining us from today, I encourage you to reach out to your own land grant university system if you're not part of the state of Maryland. You can always reach out to us as well, of course, but every state in the United States does have this service, and it does focus a lot on agriculture education, so and a lot of other things as well, but we do encourage you to search that out if you have access to the internet. Of course, you do if you're on this call. You can just put in the search engine cooperative extension with the name of the state that you live in, and you'll get lots of great resources. So I encourage you to reach out to those services if you have any specific questions for where the area that you might live in. So to start off, I would like to just start with what is a definition of an herb. So there are two basic definitions that people use when they hear the word herb. Sometimes it's the longer word herbaceous. So an herbaceous plant is something that does not produce a woody stem, and it's going to die back to the ground each winter. So for today's purposes, that's not really what we're talking about. Today we are going to use the gardener's definition of it has culinary, aromatic, or medicinal use. It could be the root, the stem, the foliage, the flower, or even the seed that's used on the plant. So just remember that. So sometimes these herbs may have a woody stem, and sometimes they may not. So we are going to be using this gardener's definition today. And just some general herb culture. So what is going to make herbs happy? The reason that I like to talk about herbs is because in general, they're pretty easy. If you've never started with any type of gardening, I think this is a great place to start. One reason is that you can pretty much put them all in the same grouping, that they all love full sun. So full sun is at least 6 hours. Anywhere 6 to 8 hours is what we say of direct sunlight. That's going to give you the classification of full sun. Anywhere from 4 to 6 hours is what we call part sun, and less than that is usually part shade or full shade. So herbs are going to do best in at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight. If you don't have that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot plant herbs. It just means that they may not produce as well for you, or you may have a little bit more difficulty getting them to thrive. Okay, the one exception to this rule of full sun would be anything in the mint family or the monardas, so the bee balms. So they can take more of a part sun or part shade atmosphere and still thrive. So if you do have shade, you might want to consider those other herbs to try, or to start with at least. The next part of herb culture that I wanted to talk to you about was what type of soil they need. So herbs are kind of interesting. They don't like highly fertile soil, which is the exact opposite of most other vegetables and fruits that we talk about in our home garden. They don't like a lot of nitrogen, especially. That gives them too much leafy growth, which, you may think, well, that would just be more leaves for me to harvest. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. If we have too much leafy greens and too much growth occurring, the essential oils may not be there and they may not be as flavorful. So just remember, they like a well-drained soil. I like to tell my master gardeners that I work with, that means they don't like wet feet. So if you can mix a little sand in, you know, if you have native soils, if you're just going into your backyard and you have traditionally more clay or heavy soils, you can mix a little sand in there, or, you know, some compost maybe to kind of lighten the soil. If you're using just a container with a soilless growing media, that's going to be well drained enough. You won't need to add anything like sand to that. So just remember, soil is important, not overly fertile, but well drained. The other question I get a lot is, what about protection in the winter? So where we live, we get a lot of snow up here in the mountains of Garrett County, Maryland. So we need to give our herbs, our perennials and biennials, a little bit more protection. So if they're in a container, that might mean either taking them inside to an unheated garage or an unheated space, or if nothing less, putting them up against the side of a building. The side of the building is going to give them a windbreak, and for us, where I live, the wind is generally what causes the issues. You know, 25 years ago, we used to have a lot of snow cover throughout the whole season, the whole winter season. We don't tend to have as much snow now, so we don't have that insulating layer to protect some of the roots and delicate areas of our perennials and biennials. So giving them a windbreak is at the very least thing that you can do. If you have your herbs planted in the ground, you can give them extra mulch. So whether that's like a pine bark mulch, or whether that's, you know, hay or straw, whatever you have available, just something to, again, help keep some of that cold wind off of the root structure. The other thing I wanted to tell you just in general about all herbs is that they don't have a whole lot of insects or disease problems. So that's kind of another reason that I like for folks to start with herb gardening if they're just getting into gardening. It's something easy that they don't have to worry about. I did put these major insects that we do see sometimes bothering our herbs. We have aphids, which are soft-bodied insects that the ladybird beetle or the ladybugs feed on. We have white flies. A lot of times, if you know, we may see white flies on our house plants or on our herbs in our indoor growing environment, so watch out for them. We can also see mites on some of our indoor plants, and even outdoors. Mites are going to have 8 legs just like a spider, so if you can get one of them underneath a magnifying glass or something like that, then you can for sure tell that it is a mite. And then of course outside we do have slug damage. You can always help eliminate slugs by you know, putting more mulch down or using crushed eggshells or something like that. So just some of the major insect pests that we see, but for the most part it's not too much of a problem. So next I wanted to talk a little bit about why do we want to plant herbs, or how are we going to decide what herbs we want to plant? So in Garrett County, I always tell folks you need to know what is your cold hardiness zone. So the United States Department of Agriculture has a cold hardiness zone for every place in the United States. On the next slide, you can go to this website, planthardiness.ars.usd.gov / these letters. If you go to this slide, or this website, excuse me, you can put in your zip code and it'll tell you exactly what your plant hardiness zone is. And this is going to be really important whenever you're planting any type of perennial, whether it's a perennial herb or whether it's a perennial fruit tree or something, anything that's going to come back year after year. And the data that goes into this is all based on, of course, your climate and how cold it generally gets. So this is a great way for you to make sure that you're not investing in a plant that's not going to be cold hardy in your area. Just to back up here, on some other things you want to consider when you're selecting herbs. You want to think about the plant characteristics. So there are some beautiful colors, whether that be flower color or foliage color. Herbs are an awesome way to add texture to your landscape through different leaf shapes. We're going to see some pictures of that here in just a few minutes. You do want to also think about the mature height, especially if you're doing a lot of planters or container gardens. Some things like dill, if they're really happy, can get up to 5 feet tall. So if you are going to plant dill, make sure you put that either in the center of a planter if it's going to be seen from all sides, or only in the back. The other thing to think about is that herbs are awesome for attracting some different types of butterflies. So even though the butterfly larva is going to eat some of these plants, it's really important that if you want to see the butterflies, that you're willing to share some of your herbs with the larva or the caterpillars. So just be aware that, you know, hyssop, catnip, dill, and fennel are all ones that are really easy to grow and that will help you attract these different types of butterflies to your garden. They can also be used, again, like I said, for flowers or fillers in a planter. And the very last thing you want to consider when deciding what you want to grow is, what do you want to eat? What do you want to preserve? That should be the most important question, at least for me. You know, what do you want to share with your family? What do you want to add to your diet? And that should be where you start when trying to decide what herbs to grow. The other thing that might be a new concept to some folks on the call is something called companion planting. So I put a couple of really nice links in here for companion planting, which is basically the art and science of putting crops together that are going to do really well together. Sometimes different crops exude different compounds from their roots that other plants really enjoy, or that can help even limit pest problems, or, you know, there's just a whole lot of theories around it. Maybe it provides physical support for the plant. One of the most common examples of companion planting is something called the Three Sisters Garden. I don't know if anybody on the call has ever heard of that, but it's where you would plant 3 different crops. It would be corn, a squash or pumpkin of some sort, and then a pole bean. So every plant in this Three Sisters garden gives something to the other plant. So the corn acts as a pole for the pole bean. The pole bean is a legume, so it's going to help put nitrogen into the soil, which the corn absolutely needs. And then the squash or the pumpkin helps to shade the other plants in the system and help give it moisture and help to prevent the weeds from competing. So that's an example of companion planting. And here, these 2 links at the bottom of this slide helps to tell you some other examples of companion planting that have a lot of herb examples. So for example, one of the things that we've had trouble with in the past in our garden are cucumber beetles. I don't know why, but I struggle with them every single year. So one of the things that you can plant with your cucumbers is radishes, as well as nasturtium, which isn't listed on this particular chart, but a couple other of the charts do list nasturtium as being a great way to combat cucumber beetles as well as squash bugs. So that's just an example of how your plants can help work together and give you a little bit of help in your vegetable garden. When you're thinking about the design of your herb garden, you do want to think about the available space that you have. Herbs are pretty lenient. They either can take a lot of space. A lot of your perennial herbs will spread and take up a lot of space. More of the annual herbs, they can be put into almost anything and be pretty well happy. They don't grow excessively for the most part. So you're not going to be taken over by a lot of the annual herbs. So again, I think they're a great place to start. Just some other general considerations as we get into this, before we get into the specifics of each different type of crop, would be, you know, some other things to consider. So in general, you don't usually want to mix your annual herbs with your perennial herbs because they're going to have different needs. You want to make sure that if they do you know, like full sun, like I said, most of them do like full sun. You don't want to mix those in with ones that like shade. Keep those plant light requirements separated. And again, if they do like drier soils, make sure you keep those together, which again, other than the mint and the monarda, most of them do like the dry soils. So this is one of the inspiring things that I saw on Pinterest a couple years ago, which I thought was just awesome. It's just an old wagon wheel that somebody has taken and turned into a wheel, or turned into an herb planter. So I thought that was just a great way to kind of get people inspired. Again, you have lots of different types of herbs all in one small area. Some of it might not be enough of one particular herb to preserve or save, but it would be enough for you to use fresh probably. So I just thought that was a fun picture to show. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was herb container gardening. We get a lot of questions in general about container gardening, and the answer is that you can pretty much put anything in a container as long as the container is large enough. So just remember that the larger the container, the happier the plants are going to be for the most part, and herbs are no different. The other cool thing to think about is that you can do a lot of different theme gardens with these containers. So maybe you want to grow everything you need to make salad dressing, you know, all the herbs that you need to make salad dressing at least in one container. I think that's pretty fun. Or my daughter loves pizza, so I think we're going to try this year to make a pizza garden. So that's kind of fun. So everything we would need to make pizza sauce as far as herbs go in one container, just so we have it all together. Something fun. When you are picking a container, if you're not using a traditional container from the store, just be sure that it does have drainage holes. If it's a reused item, so something that traditionally is not a container, so maybe a basket or a barrel or something like that, we do recommend that it would be a food grade container that you're using, just to ensure that there are no toxins that are going to leach out of that material. If you're unsure, you can always layer it with something like just a plastic bag. That'll help make sure that nothing comes out of it. Just be sure that if you do layer it with plastic, that you do poke some drainage holes. Especially if you're in a place that gets a lot of rain like I am, you have to have drainage, or else your plants are just going to drown, and all your hard work will be for nothing. So be sure that you do have drainage holes in any type of container that you do. The other thing that I've seen a lot of people put into hanging baskets are herbs. So I just gave you a few examples of, thyme, nasturtium, even mint and rosemary can be put into hanging baskets. So that's something fun to try. As with containers, hanging baskets are going to most definitely dry out quicker. So they will have to have more care and more water given to them. And if you're really feeling spunky and excited about herb gardening, you can also try topiaries. These end up being beautiful. So things like bay, lavender, or even rosemary can be used as a topiary. I just wanted to hit a little bit on indoor gardening or indoor herb gardening. There are some really easy ones that you can start with. So there's a list of them here in the middle. So things like basil and mint and sage and thyme and cilantro and even chives can be grown indoors pretty easily. I will caution folks that if you are taking a container of herbs that have been grown outside for the entire season, and then you decide that you want to move them inside at the end of your growing season before a frost, they might not do the best. Once they get used to having that direct, natural sunlight outside, you may see them kind of die off and not do so well whenever you move them inside. So just a word of caution, that happens to everyone. It's just different types of light. If you have a grow light, if that's something you're interested in investing in, you could put them under a grow light to help, with the transition. You also want to lay off on the water so that the growth will slow down as they kind of try to transition into this lower light environment. I found most successfully to grow plants indoors is to start the plants indoors and leave them in there, especially when it comes to herbs. So there's just some guidance here. Don't overwater them. Again, they like to have dry soil, but they do have to have some moisture. So a real general rule of thumb is just to stick your finger in the container. If it feels like there's moisture still there, wait another day before you water. Once it starts to really feel dry, that's when you need to add water. And for the most part, herbs, even inside, don't need a lot of fertilizer. just some more general information. Again, I'll be sending these notes out as a PDF. So if you have, you don't have to take extensive notes, and you will have them for your reference later on. But for the most part, if you do have fluorescent lights, they're going to need at least 14 hours of light underneath the fluorescent lights to flourish. And again, just make sure that you don't overwater them to be successful with indoor herb growing. Just a little bit on herb propagation. The majority of your herbs that are going to be annuals can be seeded directly, or you can take cuttings. Cuttings are a form of asexual propagation where you're going to get an exact copy of the parent plant or a clone of that parent. So just, we have a few slides in here about cuttings just in case you want to try that in the future. Most of your perennials can either be divided or layered. Again, just like with most other perennials, you can take a chunk, cut part of the root apart and then share it with a friend or family member or a different part of your garden. I just stuck this slide in here just for your reference. If you're interested in learning how to do layering, these are some easy ways. This top right-hand corner called simple layering is the absolute easiest way, where you would just get a branch that's still connected to the parent, bend it down, put some soil on it, and leave it there for probably 3 or 4 months. Come back, cut it off from the parent plant, and then you could dig up a whole new plant that would be, again, a clone of the parent. And that works well with, woody stems or semi-woody stems, like maybe rosemary. Works great with grapes, which I know we're not talking about today, but a lot of your shrubs and things like that, you can also do that technique with. All right. So next I wanted to talk about harvesting. I did get several questions about how do you harvest herbs. So the one thing that you do need to remember with harvesting herbs is that you need to do it more often than not. I have several folks that come to me and say, well, I just don't know where to cut them, or I just don't know how often to cut them. So generally a rule of thumb is once they are established, so once they're actively growing, especially with your annuals, you can harvest 1/3 to 1/2 of them before they start to flower. So however often that may be, it depends on how healthy and happy they are. But generally, if a plant is growing, in the peak of our growing season here, I can harvest my basil every 2 weeks, or sometimes almost every week. Again, it just depends on how happy and healthy the plant is. The time that you should harvest is going to be in the morning. That's going to be when the plants have the most, again, oils and fragrance to them. If you wait until the afternoon when it's going to be hot, the stomata are going to open on the plant, which could release some moisture to help keep the plant cool, and they may not be as flavorful. So just remember that in general. And I love this slide because if you are trying new to harvesting herbs, there are some rules to where you should cut them. If you see the picture on the left, the area with the purple lines point to the node, the NODE, which is the active growing region of the plant. So anywhere there's a bud is going to be where there's a node. So what happens is whatever bud is highest on the plant has the dominance. So if you were to cut where the line says cut here, then these 2 little leaves that are sitting there just kind of hanging out will then have the dominance, and that's what's going to start to grow. So this is why whenever you pinch your basil, it gets bushier. You're taking one stem and you're now giving the dominance to both of these 2 leaves to then start growing. So the area between the node is called the internode region, and you do not want to cut in the area there because that stem would just sit there and would turn brown. There's no way for the plant to heal itself right there because there's no actively dividing cells. So just remember that. This would be the same with a parsley plant or, any of your broadleaf plants for harvesting. Now, when we talk about harvesting things like chives, there are no nodes on a chive, so it's best to cut them back pretty much all the way to the soil line. Okay. A little bit more about harvesting them. When should you do it? Root crops like onions, garlic, and ginger, you want to harvest them in the fall of the year. These would be your perennial bulbs. Your annuals and your biennials, which we're going to talk about what each plant is here in just the last section. We're going to talk about specifics for each of the very common herbs that I hear people talk about and that I've grown. So you can harvest them all season long once you get them established. Flowers, anything that you're going to harvest for flowers like lavender, marigolds, or rosemary, you want to harvest them as soon as the flowers begin to open. Anything with seeds like coriander, the best thing is to let the seeds ripen on the plant as much as possible before harvesting. That ensures that all the nutrients for the plant is going to go into the seeds, and that way you're going to have, very nutritious seeds to harvest. And in general, perennials and biennials, you can harvest them anytime except for late in the fall. You probably want to give them about 2 to 3 weeks, maybe a month before the killing frost is going to come, so they have enough time to set all of the reserves into their roots for whenever they have enough time to set the reserves in their roots to come back the following year. Okay. Moving right along, we're going to get into some pictures here pretty soon, I promise, so you won't just hear me talking. But there's a couple really easy ways to preserve your herbs. Drying is the number one way that most folks do that. That can include anything from tying them in bundles like the first picture you saw, putting them in front of a fan in a nice warm room. You can also do them, I've heard, in the oven and in a dehydrator. The real important thing to remember about drying herbs is that you kind of want it to happen quickly so that you don't have any other microorganisms like, molds or fungus that are going to grow in there. You want to get them dried pretty quick. So the quicker, the better. Once they're dry, you can put them in airtight containers. So whether that's, mason jars or, special herb containers, whether it's Ziploc bags, just anything to, keep the moisture out once you get them dry. And also you want to keep them in the dark area so that the color doesn't get leached out as easily. One of my favorite ways to preserve herbs is by freezing them. A lot of times I'll just take my excess herb that I've harvested and cut it up into small sections, put it into an ice cube tray and either fill the ice cube tray with oil like olive oil or even just water. Let that freeze. Once the ice cubes are frozen, I pop them out and put them in a freezer bag. And then whenever I'm going to fry, like hamburger or something like that, I can pop some of my basil out to make spaghetti. You have a little bit of moisture for the meat, and then you also get the herb as well. You can also, of course, put them in oils and vinegars. Then the oil or the vinegar is going to take on the flavor of the herb. Same way with sugar and salts. But usually when we're using herbs, one of the main advantages is to try to get away from, using so much oil, using so much sugar, or using so much salt. So I'll just leave that up to each of you. This is a great publication from the Nebraska, Lancaster County University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And when you get the slides, there'll be this link that you can download it, but it actually tells you tips for reducing fat, what herbs and spices you should use to reduce sugar and salt intake. Because again, if, we all want to try to be healthier, as healthy as we can be. So if we can eliminate some fat and sugar and salt from our diet by using herbs, especially herbs that we've grown our own self, I just think that's a wonderful thing to do. So again, you'll have that link for you to access that, but that's a publication that I've used for several years, and a lot of folks really enjoy reading it. One of the last tips I have for you with cooking with herbs, because again, I have a lot of folks that say, I can get them to grow, but I'm not always so excited about harvesting them. And then how do I actually know when to use them in cooking? Just one tip for you is that if you are using dried herbs, you want to add them at the beginning of your recipe because they need time to rehydrate with the moisture in your recipe. Versus if you're adding fresh herbs, you want to actually add those at the end of the recipe so you don't cook all the oils out of them. And if you have a recipe that calls for dried herb, a certain amount, like a teaspoon of dried herbs, then you would want to double that to make up for the using fresh herbs. So instead of a half a teaspoon, it would be a whole teaspoon. So just some quick tips on actually cooking with herbs. So we're getting into the specifics of the different types of herbs. So we're going to start with annual herbs. I see. I'm going to just take a quick second to mute myself and check out. Okay, sorry about that. I just wanted to take a second to check out the chat box. Thank y'all for the comments so far, and I'm not following it right now, so I will go back if there are any questions that are missed towards the end. So we are going to talk specifically about annual herbs now. So these are going to be the ones that are going to only last for one season, and you're going to have to replant them year after year, okay? So my very first one that I wanted to talk to you about is the Nasturtium. And I just started growing this one probably 10 years ago. Whenever I worked in a greenhouse, we would add them to some of the hanging baskets to give them a splash of color. The cool thing about nasturtiums are that they have huge seeds. This top picture on the left-hand side shows what the seeds look like, and they're very interesting. So if you have kids or work with kids, I think it's always fun to have these really big seeds because they like something that they can touch, and you don't have to worry about them losing them or planting too many. So this is the nasturtium, lots of different varieties. They have a peppery flavor. They're very high in vitamin C, and you can eat both the foliage and the flowers. And I will warn you that they are a little spicy. We were doing a taste test with these one time at our farmer's market as a plant clinic, and I'll never forget a kid came up and the child said, well, can I taste it? And we said, okay, sure, as long as your caregiver said that it's okay. And I'll never forget the face that child made. It was not an impressed face, that is for sure. So just be forewarned that not every herb is everyone's cup of tea. What you like, somebody else may not like. But nasturtium is a great one to add. Even if you're not going to eat it, it's a great companion plant for a lot of things. So things like radishes, cabbage, again, anything in the cucurbit family, which would be your cucumbers, your squash, your pumpkins, even under fruit trees. And these plants can get absolutely massive, and they will actually self-seed. So that is a word of caution if you have them somewhere. Again, those big seeds are pretty viable. They will last in the environment. So I've had these come up in my high tunnel a couple different years after only planting them once. But they're a very cool looking flower, and one that I encourage you to try if you've never tried it. Very, very, very easy to grow. And the foliage is just absolutely beautiful. Some of them are actually, like this variety I think is called Peaches and Cream. And the foliage is actually also kind of mottled with some white in it. So that's kind of cool. Again, the foliage will also give you some different textures that you might not have in your garden otherwise. The next one I have for you is cilantro. So this one, I grow fresh vegetables to sell to one of the local grocery stores here, or specialty stores, I guess, here not too far from my home. And this is one that has just absolutely exploded in popularity in the last 5 years. If you would ask somebody, I would say 10 years ago, if they grew cilantro, I would say the answer would probably be no, probably not. But now it's a hot one. Everyone wants cilantro, and I attribute it to a lot of the new recipes that I'm seeing, again, on social media and things like that for all like the fresh salsas. A lot of your salsa recipes will call for fresh cilantro. And I've been told that if you like cilantro, then you have a certain gene in your body, and if you don't like cilantro, then you might not have that gene. So whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But I know in my family, my brother loves it, and I'm not a real big fan, unfortunately. I can eat a little bit of it, but to me it kind of tastes like soap, so I think that I don't have the gene, and he must have the gene. So that's the story we're going with. Some things to note about growing cilantro is that if you let it flower and go to seed and use the seed itself, that's actually when it's called coriander. And if you just eat it fresh foliage, the leaves itself, that's when it's called cilantro. It does not like to be transplanted. This is what I've learned the hard way. So plant it from seed wherever you want it to grow. If you can't do that, I would recommend putting it in a peat pot or a newspaper container and starting it in there so that you don't have to, disturb the seed roots or the seedling roots. So you can just plant the whole entire container of the plant, the transplant, wherever you want it to be. So again, very easy to grow. Again, a very hot commodity right now. So if you like those fresh salsas, then you should try cilantro. German chamomile is the next one I have for you. And this one is one that I actually tried last year for the very first time. I wasn't sure how it would go, but I have to say that it was one of the very, very easy herbs to grow. So with cilantro, you can either harvest the leaves or just the flowers. Most people do not cilantro, chamomile, Chamomile, you can harvest the leaves or the flowers. Most people just like the flowers. The foliage tends to make the tea a little bit more bitter. You can do the flower either green right off the vine, or you can let it dry. And I have to tell you that this one will reseed itself quite prolifically. So it looks very much like a daisy. So if you've ever experienced much with daisies, you know that each of those flower heads has hundreds or if not thousands of tiny little seeds. So just be careful if you don't want this to come back. But the foliage looks very much like a dill foliage, so it's pretty. At least mine was. So if you're looking for something new to try, I would give German chamomile a good thought of trying something new. So basil is another annual herb. Again, if you're looking for something easy to start out with, I absolutely recommend basil. The one thing you need to remember about it is that you don't want to let it go to seed. You don't want to let it go to flower. That will make it more bitter. So make sure that you pinch off the flowers before they start to produce. The shorter you can keep them, the better flavor your basil leaves will have. There's more than 150 different varieties. You can see from these different pictures, there's like a purple ruffled leaf here in the middle, which, gives you a real nice pop of color in your landscape. If you're looking for something that's, we don't always see that color a whole lot, so something to consider. This is one that you definitely can grow indoor all year round. Again, if you can start it from seed inside, you'll probably have better luck than taking something that was outside all season and trying to move it back in. Propagate it from seed. That's the absolute easiest way to get more basil plants. Next one I have for you is Borage. This is one that I had one of my master gardener folks told me about last year, and she had absolute wonderful success with it. This plant is sometimes called starflower. It has perfect little blue flowers on it, and it grows really well with tomatoes, squash, and strawberries. It's even been said that it can help deter the tomato hornworm. So if you have much experience with those hornworms, they're a little intimidating. And for me, if I see less of those, the better. So you might want to try this one. It does give your, whatever you're going to put it in, a cucumber flavor, which is kind of cool. I've seen where some folks will actually take the flowers themselves and freeze them in an ice cube tray and then put the ice cubes in like water or tea or something like that to give it a real mild flavor. And it's fun for your guests or, just your friends or family or even just yourself. The next easy one that I have for you that's an annual is a dill. So dill is one that you can start from seed every season. It will reseed itself because, again, if they look at the head of the dill, which is where the seeds are, and which is the most flavorful part for harvesting, There's hundreds or maybe thousands of seeds on one of those dill heads. So if you just let one of them in your garden, you will have lots of dill coming up the next season, which is okay. You just need to be aware of it. You don't want to harvest the seeds until they are brown. Dill seeds will actually have a little stripe of white usually on them when they are completely ready to be harvested. Seeds are going to be more flavorful again than the foliage, but you can eat the foliage as well as the seeds. And I will note that it is a great larva plant for butterflies. So the black swallowtail butterfly loves the dill plant. So just be careful if you do have the caterpillars on there. You know, if you don't want them on your dill, you can always find a native patch, or not native, but a naturally occurring patch of Queen Anne's lace and move those caterpillars to kind of, you know, get them off your dill, but not injure them. And something to note is it likes to be grown with cabbage, but never with carrots. Fennel is the next annual. It's actually a perennial, but most people grow it as an annual so that they can harvest the bulbs or the bulbets. It does taste like licorice. I have to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the fennel. My aunt made it for Thanksgiving last year, and I tried, but I'm not a big licorice person either. So if you do like licorice, you ought to give this one a try. There are green and bronze varieties available. And again, if you can start it from seed where you want it to be, sometimes transplanting it can be a little bit iffy. And like I said, I've never grown this one because I just don't like it. But just be careful that it does not transplant super well. So parsley is another annual that's really, really easy to grow. There's flat-leaved and curly-leaved varieties. You can see flat-leafed here on the right-hand side on the bottom, curly on the left-hand side. A lot of chefs tell me that they prefer flat leaf because it's easier to chop. If they're going to use a garnish, then maybe curly leaf is okay. It's very high in vitamin A and C, so that's kind of an easy way to get some more vitamins into your diet. Again, super easy to grow. Doesn't really require anything special. Full sun, not too much water, and you'll have lots of parsley to harvest. Parsley potatoes, that's one of my favorite things to put together. A little bit of butter and a little bit of parsley, you're ready to roll. Stevia is another one. This is actually one that can replace sugar. It's a sweet herb. I've tried to grow this one time. I have to tell you, I did not harvest it. It was pretty, but I didn't have the best of luck with actually carrying through and harvesting it. Can be difficult to propagate. It definitely does not like to have its feet wet, and it will not tolerate any type of frost. So if anybody has examples or has tried stevia and you want to put that in the chat box, I'm sure I would love to read about it, your experience with this one. All right, moving right along into perennial bulbs. So this is kind of a stretch for an herb talk, but I get a lot of questions every year about not only onions, but also about garlic. So I thought I'm just going to put a few slides in here for folks. Of course, onions can be planted anytime. During the growing season. You can plant them really early for spring onions. You can reseed them now to get some late storage onions. So that's pretty fun. But I'll start with garlic. There are two types of garlic that most people plant. There's hardneck and then there's softneck. So softneck is usually used for storage, and your hardneck is going to be what gives you the early spring scapes. So if you want, to have basically two types of things to harvest, you might want to stick with your hardneck because you'll get the bulb in the fall of the year, and then you'll get the scapes in the spring that you can eat as just like kind of early greens. I did put some different varieties in here just in case you're looking to start them. In our area here in Maryland, we recommend that people plant their garlic around Columbus Day. Around mid-October. The goal for garlic is that you want it to be in the soil and start to grow in the fall of the year. but you don't want anything to be coming up above the ground before it starts to frost and get cold. Same thing with the soft neck varieties. I put a couple of the really good recommended varieties if you do want to start a garlic patch. Again, this is not the time of year for that, but planning ahead for the fall. General and recommendations for garlic, it does require pretty fertile soil with well-drained, high organic matter, which is the opposite of most of the other herbs that we'll talk about. Same thing with your onions. They love fertilizer. So if you've had trouble growing onions in the past, you might want to consider adding a little more compost and then some sort of fertilizer as well. You can plant them from seed or from, onion set, or even from transplants from, small plants. And one thing I thought was interesting from this fact sheet that I read was that the perfect onion has 13 layers. And every layer that you see in an onion corresponds to a leaf above the soil. So once your onions get 13 leaves, that means it should be the perfect onion. And it would be okay to go ahead and harvest that. So again, lots of fertilizer. This tells you 1 to 2 pounds for every 100 square feet. And then just a little bit about curing them if you're interested in doing that. Okay, so now we're moving into the perennial herbs. So these are going to be ones that are going to come back year after year after year. So that's going to be ones that you may want to consider if you're in a permanent spot, or if you have an area in your garden that you want to establish as a permanent herb bed. So chives are the very first herb that I ever started planting. I had a friend that gave me a clump of them, and I actually still lived at home. This was probably 15 or so years ago, and they're still growing at my mom's house right where I planted them. They're a fun one. The flowers are actually edible as well as the foliage. A very light onion flavor. And we now have even varieties that are garlic chives. So you maybe want to try those if you've already mastered just regular chives. Very, very easy to grow. Again, they will spread. The hardest thing I found about chives is trying to keep grass out of them, because you do get some competition from grass coming in there. The next perennial I have for you is something called bee balm. This is Monarda didyma. So this is the classic red, the native bee balm that we see here in our area in Maryland. It's also called bergamot for the smell and the taste. It can be a very aggressive spreader, and this is one that can actually tolerate some wetness and some shade. A lot of people tell me that you cannot kill bee balm. So just be forewarned. I have it in full sun, and some years it struggles a little more than others, but it still does pretty good. The flowers and the foliage are both edible. You can use them in teas or even in salad. And this is wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa. This is the purple or different shades of purple that you may see in people's yards. Again, another native, mainly I think more out west than here in the mountains of Maryland, but still another one that is edible. Again, the flowers can be harvested just like the bergamot or the bee balm. Next one I have for you is Roman chamomile. And this one is going to be one that's very similar to, oh goodness, sorry about that. One that's very similar to the German chamomile, but this is going to be a perennial. So if you're interested in trying this one, again, same type of what you're going to do with it. You can harvest the flowers for tea and that sort of thing, but a lot of people actually use it for a ground cover because it's so aggressive. So if you're looking for something fun that's going to be fragrant, I know my goat absolutely loves the German chamomile. I'm always a little bit, leery about feeding him too much of it, but he absolutely loves it. Then we're moving on to a lemon balm. This is a very easy one to grow. It's actually in the mint family. Very fragrant. You propagate it by root division. Again, it's going to give you a nice light lemon flavor. That's the one thing I'm very sad about not being able to do this presentation in person, is usually I'm able to bring some samples and share with folks, so you can actually use all of your senses. You can smell the herbs, you can smash the herbs, you can touch the herbs. So that is something that we are definitely one sad thing about doing this virtually, but I'm so glad that so many people are able to join. Comfrey is the next perennial herb that I have for you. So comfrey is kind of an old-timey herb in my opinion. I had never heard of comfrey until I moved to my current home, which unfortunately it now has taken over parts of my garden. Comfrey will actually propagate very easily by root cuttings. So my great-grandmother planted comfrey in the garden here probably 35, 45, 55 years ago. I don't know. But then somebody came along and actually tilled it, and then they rototilled it, and then there's tons of little root cuttings that have been spread throughout the whole garden. So comfrey is a great pollinator plant. I see bees and butterflies and everything all over it early in the season. It's actually flowering right now. In the past, it had actually been used in a poultice to help heal bruises and broken bones. A lot of research has now found that it could be a liver toxin, can cause toxicity. So we kind of do not tell folks that they should consume it. But it's definitely an easy plant to grow if you're looking for something different. You don't have to worry about it taking over if you're going to just put it in one spot and not till. Again, 2 to 4 feet. I've heard that it's very salt tolerant. So if you live, near an area that uses a lot of salt on the roads, this might be a good plant, to have out by your mailbox or something like that. Then we get into the thyme. There's more than 100 different varieties in this genus. So a lot of people actually use thyme as a ground cover. It can get pretty aggressive. Again, because it's a perennial, if it's happy, it will come back season after season after season. So it can even tolerate some drought conditions. So that's also, something nice to try. I planted thyme probably 5 years ago, and it just actually froze out this last year, so I don't have thyme anymore. Lavender is another really nice herb to try. Very popular scent for a lot of folks, very, very helpful with calming. You can use it in cooking and teas and different types of perfumes and even soaps. You do want to harvest the flowers as soon as they're just opening. You don't want to wait too long or they'll lose some of that fragrance. There are 2 different types. We have French lavender on the left and then the Spanish variety on the right. Lemon verbena is another one that's super duper easy to grow. Again, it can be a little aggressive, so just be careful if you do have lemon verbena. It gets these really cool spiky flowers on top. So again, another cool addition to your yard, your garden, to give you some different texture and some different height. It can get up to 5 feet tall. So this one will not tolerate a lot of prolonged cold and frost. So I actually end up using my lemon verbena almost as an annual. I have to replant it almost every year. Catnip, this is one that I have actually had come back for 2 years. It was more of a biennial for me. Just as the name says, catnip, your cats will love it. They'll be very, very happy if you grow this. I have to say mine did not like it whenever it was fresh. They only liked it when it was dry. So that might be something for you to think about. But you can also use it for human consumption, not just for your kitty cats. You can use it as a tea, the leaves in a tea. It's kind of mild and a little bit minty. I did not love the smell of it, so I did not try it as a tea. And just something to note that this is different from catmint. Catmint is a completely different genus and species. So you're looking for catnip. And then we get into the mint. So people either love or hate mint. It seems to be one or the other, not a whole lot of in between. Most folks tend to be a little intimidated by mint because it can become invasive. So if you are new to gardening and new to herb gardening in particular, it is nice to keep your mint either in a container that's buried with drainage holes in the bottom so that the runners and stolons don't spread, because it can become very invasive. And this is, again, one of the genuses that can actually take a lot of shade and even some wetness. We have mint that grows in our pond, like right up into the pond. It does not care about having its feet wet at all. So this says loamy but well drained, but I'm pretty sure that some varieties of mint can grow almost anywhere. And the thing I like about it is there is just a mint for every person. There's spearmint, there's peppermint, there's lemon mint, there's pineapple mint, there's apple mint. So the friend that gave me the chives also gave me a start of chocolate mint. And I swear it tasted just like Andy's candies, or smelled just like the Andy candies chocolate candy. So that's kind of fun. So try mint if you're looking for something that's easy. Again, just be careful that you don't let it get out of control, because that does happen. It can take over whole hillsides. And we're getting into oregano, again, used a lot in Italian dishes. It's really good to keep it. There's two varieties. There's trailing and bushy. So both forms, depending on what you're looking for in your landscape. It can grow from seeds or cuttings, or even from dividing the different sections of your roots. The more you pinch the flower buds, the more you're going to encourage it to grow, just like most other plants. Again, every time you pinch it, you're going to get it to put out two shoots. So you can take something that's, kind of long and stringly and kind of get it to get a little bit more full if you pinch it. Then we have rosemary, and again, another really popular herb for most folks. This one, I have trouble getting it to overwinter in my home, but I have it in a really protected place outside, and I've actually had it come back 2 or 3 years here in a 5B USDA cold hardiness zone. So I think it just really depends on how protected it is. A lot of people do try to shake it indoors from season to season, and it will get a little bit woody if you do that. So that's okay. You can always pinch off some of the woody growth when you take it back outside in the spring to encourage it to put out some new fragrant young growth that's probably going to be a little bit better for you to harvest and actually, use in your cooking. We're moving into sage. So sage can kind of be hard to grow from seed in my experience. You should replant it every couple years because it can get pretty woody. Again, I have some that's probably 6 years old now. I don't harvest the woody part, I just harvest the leaves off of it. So the woodiness is okay for me because I don't use it a whole lot. But you do want to keep it from blooming, just like most of the other herbs. If you're going to harvest them to eat or to put into cooking, you don't want to have, a lot of that woody growth there, and you don't want to let them go to flower either, because you're going to lose some of that fragrance. And just like with any plant, the whole goal of the plant is to reproduce. So once it produces flowers and starts to make seed, that's kind of like signaling the end of its life cycle. So if you can keep the plant from setting seed, that's going to be something that you can do to prolong it, to keep it growing in your landscape. I think the very last one I have for you is bay laurel or bay leaf. So this one is not hardy in our area for sure. And it can grow up to 25 feet. So if you're looking for a specimen plant that you might want to put on your deck and then, keep in your home the majority of the rest of the year, this one might be something good to try. And the very last slide I have for you is my contact information. So my name, my email, my phone number. You can visit our website if you have questions. We will be uploading this presentation to our Western Maryland Cluster YouTube channel. And I have one poll for you. If you would just be so kind as to take this quick poll, let me know if anything in the class inspired you or what it maybe inspired you to do. And I do thank you all for coming out and joining us. I will be sending the PowerPoint presentation out to everyone that that registered or that actually attended the meeting today. Thank you for your patience, and I do thank you for supporting us with these classes. We have a class scheduled every week for the next 7 weeks, so check out our Facebook page, or if you would like to see the flyer, we can email that out as well. But if you have questions, we'll try to go through these. If you want to stay on, I don't know how Miss Sherry's gotten along with answering them, but we'll check in with her and see how things are going. And if we don't get your questions today, then I will follow up with you via email. We still have some folks that are answering the poll. We're up to 81%. So I'll give people just a few more minutes and then we'll end it. All right, we're going to go ahead and end the recording. Yes. Can you guys see the results? So it looks like 41% are going to start an herb garden, 57% are going to expand the current herb garden, and 42% are going to start harvesting or preserving their herbs. So again, I thank you all for joining us, and we are going